I would like to welcome you to today's Expert Mini Briefing webinar, Avoiding the Ditch, Making an Effective Transition to Outsourcing. My name is David Goodstein, and I'm a webinar coordinator for the Outsourcing Institute. It is our pleasure to be the co-host of today's event with Deloitte Consulting. Before we commence today's session, I would like to say a few brief words about the Outsourcing Institute for those who are not familiar with us. The Outsourcing Institute is a professional association dedicated to providing independent best practices, tools, roadshow events, and networking opportunities for all forms of outsourcing. Located at outsourcing.com, we have 70,000 members globally. We specialize in providing low-cost and no-cost alternatives for outsourcing buyers in need of RFP tools, vendor selection assistance, training, as well as general support and coaching. For those who are in the market in this space, we offer an array of targeted sponsorship and promotional opportunities. Our sister company, CMS, provides recruiting services for those seeking to hire outsourced professionals experienced at buying, selling, managing, or consulting. Our contact information is at the bottom of the screen for those who have any questions. So without further ado, I will now turn it over to Mike Wilton, specialist and leader in Deloitte Consulting Outsourcing Advisory Practice.
Thank you, David. Hello, and thanks for joining today. Just a couple brief words about myself. I have over 30 years of experience in the outsourcing arena. I focus primarily on IT outsourcing engagements, but I have done also application development and maintenance projects, as well as business process outsourcing programs globally. In addition, I've also worked in organizational development in my past life. Many of my clients are large global telecommunications, manufacturing, federal government, and pharmaceutical companies. Prior to joining Deloitte 5 years ago, I had my own consulting practice. Prior to that, I spent 23 years at Hewlett-Packard, primarily in outsourcing projects. Next slide, please. But today, what I'd like to do is spend a few minutes with you to help you gain an understanding about transitions, give you a view on how they proceed through the life cycle, and help you to avoid the ditch. We want to look at some of the common pitfalls that happen during transition, look and understand the life cycle to give you a forward-looking view of how the life cycle goes and what impacts can occur both to the outsourcing project itself as well as to your own organization. I want to share with you some leading practices in planning and execution, and finally look at how do we actually successfully finish a transition at the end. Next slide, please. So what is a transition? I'd like to baseline everybody on a common understanding of what we're talking about when we say transition. In the context of outsourcing, it's generally the transfer of services from one service provider organization to another. It could be that you're outsourcing the first time and you're moving your services from your internal operations to an outsourcer, or you've already outsourced and you're moving services from one vendor to another. We see that in cases where clients want to get better pricing or improve services, or for other reasons they want to change vendors. And more we're seeing that clients want to insource, either to bring things back in-house for higher quality or to gain services that they can't get on the outside in a quality way. So a transition involves moving resources from one organization to another, or it could be even replacing portions of a legacy organization in terms of moving things to a shared service. It is a period where discovery is made about how the operations and the services are delivered today. It's not just due diligence. It's an understanding of what does a new service operation look like and how is it going to run, and implementing that operation with those new processes. It's like any other big project or program. It has a clearly defined beginning and end. And if you're insourcing for the first time or outsourcing for the first time, what it presents in many cases is the competing goals of a vendor and the client. A vendor wants to get through transition as quickly as possible. It's a fixed price, fixed duration project that they want to get through as soon as possible to get into steady state delivery and the recurring revenue generation. Clients generally want a low risk, even sometimes long time transition to avoid impact to the business. So we need to keep in mind that those competing goals are always present in a transition. Even if it's inside, you're moving things from one service delivery operation internally to another, you can have those competing goals. Some of the impacts that we see is around this are credibility. Vendors don't get a second chance to make a good impression. Their credibility, many times, the first time they outsource, is based upon how they execute a transition. And they begin to set the client's expectations of how things are going to go in steady state delivery. Also, a transition can impact the organizational motivation. If the communications and the change management components are handled well, an organization becomes energized, renewed, even in cases where employees are impacted, it can be a positive situation for those left behind because it gives them more opportunities inside of the organization. Other impacts to the transition and to the long-term viability of the outsourcing agreement come from executive support. If you don't have the proper executive engagement, either from the sponsors of the program or from other stakeholders within your company, it can have a negative effect on the outcome of the transition. And the same with the rest of the organization. If the transition doesn't go well, it can have a large impact to the credibility of the organization actually moving services. And that can be a long-lasting effect. Next slide, please. In 2008, we did a survey in a paper that we did called Why Settle for Less? And some of the findings that came out of that related to transition were that many organizations are not ready to move services. And that's primarily due to the internal processes are not well enough defined to outsource. Sometimes that's known as your mess for less. In this case, it could be very detrimental because as an outsourcer tries to take over processes that are what I call tribal knowledge, they're not documented. They could be just known for being executed the way they are year over year. It can be a really tough problem to overcome when you try and move that to an outsourcing vendor. Communication and relationship management are very important. Vendors tend to become very internally focused throughout a transition. We're going to talk some more about that in a minute. But what happens is as that relationship, those communications break down, and as the relationship breaks down, it can have a negative, long-lasting effect on the relationship with the vendor. Other drivers that cause issues throughout a transition are of quality. The quality of the transition is not being measured and monitored properly. Services get moved and they're not well understood, and they get implemented in ways that are not operational after day one. Also, many clients tend to overlook the fact that they're paying an incumbent as well as the new vendor, and it needs to be very carefully planned how those costs are controlled and managed during the transition so that you're not double paying for too long. Special reporting of the schedule and knowledge transfer activities need to be put into place so that everybody clearly understands what's happening as part of the transition. And the retained organization roles need to be clearly defined, and training needs to be provided for those roles especially for moving people from an operations role into a vendor management role. Next slide, please. This is a view of the transition life cycle and what I call the client satisfaction curve. So as we look at this, when we're in the honeymoon stage, the contract has been signed, the big dinners have been had, everybody's excited about moving into the outsourcing agreement, and we tend to get into what we call the vendor runs the show. We try and throw everything over the wall, let the vendor run the show. And we're going to talk about how that impacts the overall life cycle here in a second. As we get through the life cycle into what I call the natural decline, the change, the complexity, the amount of work, trying to keep the lights on operations working while people are doing the transition, the workload tends to increase. Teams on the vendor side are struggling to ramp up as well as do the vendor transition. All of these pressures tend to mount, and it creates a less optimistic view of the engagement overall, and the overall satisfaction as a result begins to decrease. And we've seen this like clockwork in many transitions that we've assisted with. Between the 90 and 120 days into a large transition, that wait begins to create many issues. If the governance is not correct, we begin to lose the core vision, and the value proposition becomes eroded because things are getting delayed. Schedules are increasing and issues are mounting. The way to reverse that and to keep it from further decline is via proactive issue, risk, and schedule management. And regular communication with a mature transition methodology driving the transition helps keep it from the satisfaction from going down because it creates momentum. If things are not poorly planned and executed, what tends to happen is the issues become overwhelming, the program tends to grind to a stop, costs increase, and then the teams are basically having to relook at the transition and figure out what went wrong and how do we restart it, which adds cost for everybody. To avoid that, having the proper foundation of a solid master transition plan, issue and risk processes, and good solid relationships between the vendors helps the program begin to capture the planned value, move into stability, and as that happens, the momentum tends to gain because people are seeing that things are actually becoming real and the effective implementation of services is progressing. Next slide, please. We start our transition planning by identifying what we call the 12 pillars, all controlled by a transition program office. Each of these 12 pillars has key activities and deliverables that they're responsible for. Resources should be allocated to each of these 12 pillars, whether it's a role or multiple individuals. That depends on the size of the transition. But these 12 pillars become the foundation for the master transition plan. And the work that has to be done in each of those 12 pillars should be based on the activities and deliverables that drive towards steady state in each of these areas. Next slide, please. So transition planning is, for us, the key element in making sure that we build a successful transition program. It has to start from the top. So the overall corporate objectives that are trying to, that are planned to be accomplished through moving to outsourcing need to be clearly defined. And the transition plan itself needs to drive toward those objectives. Taking the 12 pillars that I talked about before, it needs to be simply organized and realistic. And it needs to be realistic based on resource allocation to be able to accomplish the transition. Clearly understanding how much time an internal team has to help support a transition while keeping the lights on needs to be factored into that plan. As I mentioned earlier, it's a project, and like any large, complicated project, it needs to be based on project management fundamentals and principles. And it needs to be integrated. It needs to be cross-functional, cross-company, cross-tower. All the dependencies for things like infrastructure, resource onboarding, security and compliance need to be mapped into the master transition plan. So all the dependencies are well known. And again, all the resources responsible for those activities are clearly defined, as well as their allocation to the transition program. Transition planning presents the first opportunity to execute the governance. So whatever the steady state governance is going to be needs to be identified as part of transition planning, and that governance structure and processes need to be implemented as part of the transition. That helps move seamlessly from the transition into steady state operations the key processes that are needed in both areas. So things like change management, demand management, configuration management, those processes need to be clearly defined as part of the transition and manage the transition into steady state. The next component to make sure that we include in the plan is relationship. Many times moving into a new outsourcing relationship creates situations where trust is broken, especially early on, again, where I said the vendor, the first impression is not met well or doesn't happen in a good way. Those activities need to be planned for to create the teamwork, create the trust, create the relationship. Because a good, solid relationship can overcome many issues throughout a transition. So once the top-down objectives have been identified, the structure has been identified around the 12 pillars, then bottoms up, the transition plan needs to be built. Many of the transition plans that we assist clients with today are very large and complex, and it takes full-time people to actually manage those and keep all of those dependencies, issues, and risks at bay. Next slide, please. So like any other large program, transition management and monitoring is important. We need to keep in mind that it needs to be a common process based on the vendor management view of the program. So that means that actions and issues, status, risk, governance, quality, and all of that are being managed jointly across both the vendor and the client in the same way on a regular basis. The program should very quickly, within the first 2 or 3 weeks, get into a weekly cycle of monitoring and reporting and issue management to be able to drive those issues out as quickly as possible. And just backing up to the vendor management, relationship management components I talked about earlier, having that communication and rapport as part of this is very important. And it helps to create the foundation for a long-lasting relationship with the vendor. Next slide, please. So getting to steady state is the goal of all of this, and clearly defining what does that steady state look like is very important. As we move through the readiness and planning of an outsourcing engagement, the transition planning should start. So by contract award, we're fully into the knowledge transfer and all of the other infrastructure and process-related transition activities. As things move into steady state and the service demonstration becomes real, and the service cutover the service cutover date becomes near, understanding what are the metrics that define the end of the transition, and everybody has agreed to need to be defined prior to that point. So things like services, quality, project, and change. What are the gaps in things like transformation activities or innovation? Have we moved the staff according to the plan? Are we meeting our financial targets and governance? All of those things need to be clearly defined so that once the transition is over, the end is clear and agreed to by everyone. So just in closing, we looked at a few common pitfalls of transition, understanding the life cycle to give you a view of how things can go. But finally, we think that starting with a detailed, comprehensive plan is the key foundation for successful execution. Tightly manage your schedule and risks on a daily basis. Don't let issues mount up. That also helps or causes a negative impact on transition execution. Have a comprehensive quality management process. Focus on the relationship. And finally, a well-planned and executed transition will lay the foundation for a successful and long-lasting outsourcing relationship. So, next slide. Thank you for joining. You can also get more information from our paper that's posted on the Outsourcing Institute website called Avoiding the Ditch. And for more information, you can contact myself, Mike Wilton, or John Tweardy at Deloitte Consulting. Thank you for your time.